All right. Well, today I'd like to describe to you the history of the psychotherapy field in under 5 minutes. Now, this can be interesting to you if you're a therapist, and this can be interesting to you if you're a non-therapist interested in the field of psychotherapy for whatever reason, because you want to be a more informed consumer, or because you're just interested in psychotherapy in general because it has a big influence on culture via psychotherapeutic writers and psychotherapists insofar as they influence their clients and their clients go out in the world and influence others. Psychotherapists can be seen as the kind of shamans of today, which I don't say to put myself up on a pedestal in my capacity as a therapist, but that just seems to be the way that it's gone, for better or for worse. Okay, now you can understand the psychotherapy field in under 5 minutes for a variety of reasons, one of which is that many of the basic traditions of psychotherapy arose around Freud. Actually, five of them arose around Freud, and then one of them arose relatively independently in North America, and one of them arose relatively independently in Europe. So let's start with Freud, who in the late 1800s was working with his mentor, the neurologist Breuer, with patients who were considered to be hysterical, which basically meant they had physical symptoms for which doctors could find no physical cause. And it seemed to be that some kind of psychological factor was causing these physical symptoms. Breuer and Freud, really Breuer to start out, developed what he called a talking cure, whereby his patient would talk about things and find relief from these symptoms, which could range from paralysis to blindness, by talking. So he called it the talking cure. Freud became real interested in this, started practicing it, and realized he could learn things about people from having them free associate. Now, he started by doing hypnosis, but he later turned to the technique of free association, where he would have someone lie on their back and just say whatever came to mind with as little censorship as possible. And in doing so, he learned a lot about people. He became interested in repressed sexuality, perhaps because a lot of his patients were sexually repressed. This was Victorian Europe, late 1800s, and it was way prior to the sexual revolution, so to speak. This was a period of humanity's history where sexuality was not really on the table, so to speak, of conscious discussion or consciousness, really in most senses. It was quite underground culturally, and seemed to be causing problems for these patients. So Freud developed something that he called psychoanalysis, which was oriented around an understanding of how sexual repression led to other sorts of problems. And he attracted a number of other doctors and other people who were interested in his work. And out of this arose eventually a variety of other psychotherapy traditions alongside psychoanalysis. So to make it real simple, we can go through various of Freud's followers who ended up being the heads of other psychotherapy traditions. Okay, so psychoanalysis is a broad psychotherapy tradition that continues to develop in the modern day, but there are a variety of others. So one of these others arose out of the interest of Carl Jung, who was an early associate of Freud. And Jung developed a way of doing therapy that was oriented around, you could say, spirituality, concepts of the collective unconscious, concepts of archetypes, symbols that existed on a cultural level, not just an individual level. Jung ended up being what we could think of as the forefather of the transpersonal psychotherapy tradition. Now, another person who was interested in Freud's work early on was Alfred Adler. Adler had developed a lot of his own ideas kind of independently of Freud, but he was an associate of Freud early on. And he ended up separating from Freud, as a lot of these early innovators did, and being at the head of Adlerian therapy, and ultimately what we could think of as the forefather of the cognitive behavioral tradition, although he's not often recognized as such But if you look to the cognitive behavioral tradition, often the two people who are put up as the fathers of that tradition are Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck. Both Ellis and Beck considered Adler to be their primary influence. I think makes a lot of sense to understand Adler as the forefather of the cognitive behavioral tradition. Okay, so that's three: Freud, Jung, and Adler. Those three guys used to be considered a kind of trio. They were very famous in the early part of the 20th century. But there's a couple others. One was Wilhelm Reich, somewhat later, a student of Freud's who ended up going his own way, and he was really interested in how problems manifest in the physical body. Became the forefather of the body psychotherapy tradition. When we say, I hold my tension in my shoulders, that's a Reichian concept. Okay, so the body psychotherapy tradition is a fourth tradition of psychotherapy that, like all the others, continues to thrive in the modern day. And then another was Otto Rank, who became, maybe along with Ferenczi, the Salvador Ferenczi was another really cool guy who you can study. But Otto Rank was probably the first who became the forefather of the existential psychotherapy tradition, which went on to include Carl Rogers and more contemporarily Irvin Yalom. But Rank is, I would put him at the head of that tradition. Although, of course, that tradition is a little bit like a bunch of cats who aren't easy to herd together. But there you can see a broad existential tradition starting with Rank. That being interested in basic issues of life like death, the issue of meaning, how we relate with one another as equals in the present moment, that kind of thing, the existential tradition. Okay, so we've named 5, and that leaves just 2. One of the remaining traditions developed, as I had said earlier, more or less independently in North America, and at the head of that tradition was Milton Erickson, and that would be the systemic tradition. This is a tradition oriented, you could say, around evoking patients' or clients' resources and working with systems like families and other sorts of systems to make them more functional. So it's oriented around functionality and resourcefulness. And then the final tradition arose in Europe, and again, relatively independently of Freud, and that would be the expressive tradition or the expressive arts tradition, which includes a number of sub-traditions, psychodrama or drama therapy, which was started by Jacob Moreno, and then you have art therapy and dance movement therapy, both of which are great modalities. And all of these together, along with music therapy and other therapies based on the arts, are considered the expressive therapy tradition. Obviously oriented around the aesthetic capacity, or what I think of as the passions. Okay, so that gives us 7 therapy traditions: psychoanalytic, the transpersonal, the cognitive behavioral, the body psychotherapy tradition, the existential psychotherapy tradition, the systemic tradition, and the expressive tradition. Okay, body, psychoanalytic, systemic, expressive, existential, behavioral, transpersonal. Okay, 7 traditions, and that really is the classical therapy field in a nutshell. Now, we haven't talked about healing techniques like EMDR, tapping on meridian points. Sometimes hypnosis can be used as a kind of healing technique. I would consider that a somewhat different category, which therapists can certainly train in and get good at, and that can be extremely powerful. And we haven't talked about coaching, which is another way that I think therapists often work kind of informally, and that involves giving clients much more concrete instruction to fulfill specific life tasks. This is just talking about classical psychotherapy approaches, which are oriented around facilitating the development, sometimes the remedial development of essential psychological processes, whether those processes be sexual, physical, functional, relational, spiritual, cognitive or behavioral, or emotional, or aesthetics, as the case may be. These 7 basic traditions kind of form the essence of the classical therapy field as a whole. Okay, so it wasn't under 5 minutes, but still 10 minutes, the whole psychotherapy field. It's not too bad, right? Anyway, I hope this has been useful to you, and thanks for watching the video.